Hey there, 302. I'm Jackie Ferris. This week, the 302 is taking off to Bellanca Airfield Museum, where we are learning all about Delaware's aviation history. Buckle up, the 302 is coming in for a landing. Hey 302, we are at one of the crown jewels of Delaware aviation. I'm talking, of course, about the Bellanca Airfield Museum in Newcastle. And we're going to talk a little bit about all this beautiful place has to offer. First of all, let me introduce Bruce Lambrecht. He is the president of the Delaware Aviation Hall of Fame. Bruce, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we can even start this conversation, we have to talk about the namesake, Giuseppe Bellanca. Tell us a little bit about him. He really was a pioneer.
He was. He was born in Sicily. Went to school. He wanted to be a math teacher, but fell in love with aviation, stayed for engineering. In the meanwhile, his family moved to Brooklyn. And they said, oh, you've got to come to the United States. It's wonderful here in the United States. So he came over to the United States and he built an airplane here. And the replica is behind us here. He built it in pieces, took it on his bicycle and public transportation out to Mineola Field and put it together, didn't know how to fly. Mm-hmm. So he taught himself how to fly in that airplane.
That's amazing.
Then he started a flight school.
Mm-hmm.
Now, along the way, he moved to different aircraft companies and built aircraft for them, designed them, and had them built. And all of his designs, he was always a step ahead of the industry. And all of his aircraft held some sort of record. Now, in 1928, Mr. Henry Bellin DuPont decided that the Delaware needed a major airport. They needed someplace where someone could buy an airplane, fly an airplane, fix an airplane. And he said, I want to build a factory, and I know who I want to run it. And he called Bellanca and said, I'll build the factory if you run it. And Bellanca said, okay, but I want complete control. And Henry said, okay. And it worked out great. So in 1928, they opened the factory, and it was here until about 1955. He built about 3,000 airplanes here during that period of time. And one of the airplanes that he built was the Bellanca Cruise Air, which is the red airplane behind us. And last year we had the state legislature name that airplane the State Historic Airplane.
That's great.
So that's pretty impressive. Now, during the war, he couldn't build airplanes here because of the war effort. But what he did do, because he had probably about 3,000 workers that still had to be paid, he got the government to give him contracts to build parts of airplanes. And they built pieces for just about every major warplane here in Delaware. He did build one full airplane that he didn't design, which was a trainer called an AT-21 gunner. And it was all made out of plywood because they needed the metal for the real airplanes. But it did fly, and they trained navigators and gunners in it.
So I understand that he broke a lot of records. The longest without refueling, going over a body of water to Japan. There's several records like that. Can you talk to us about the impact he had on the record books?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, almost every one of his airplanes held a record. The Charles Lindbergh wanted a Columbia, which was one of his models. And he came to the factory and had some problems with Bellanca's partner, and so went away and went to Ryan out in California and said, build me an airplane just like the Columbia. So they built an airplane for him, and he took off, and Bellanca's partner decided he wanted to beat him to Europe. And Bellanca said, yes, you probably could, but you're not going to. And he took the airplane and dumped all the fuel out of it. And he said, you leave Lindbergh alone. And 2 weeks later, the Columbia flew from the Mineola Field up in New York, didn't stop at Paris, went all the way to Berlin with a passenger who was Levin. That's how much better an airplane it was. So that held the record for the longest distance. And actually, he could have gone to Moscow, but he had to fly around a storm over the Atlantic. The flight across the Pacific was done by his airplane that was named the Miss Vidal, which actually was named after an oil company. And it flew from Japan to the West Coast and broke a record for flying over the Pacific. And actually, when they landed in Japan originally, they were arrested as spies and had to do some interesting things to get out of that. But they did fly and break the record.
Now, you mentioned Charles Lindbergh, you mentioned the DuPonts, but another, entity that Giuseppe Bellanca worked with was the Wright Company, right?
Correct. He originally worked for the Wright Aircraft Corporation, and he built a number of different models of airplanes there. And once again, they held records as well, and it, as I said, his designs were always unique. This airplane that he built here, the first one, he was the first one in America to put wheels on an airplane. Remember, the Wright brothers had skids. He was the first one to use the motor as a tractor rather than a pusher, and the first one to put the control surfaces in the back of the airplane rather than the front.
So now we know exactly why he's the namesake for this museum here, because he was such a contributor, a pioneer in his field. And we'll be right back to talk more about the facility in just a minute.
Hi, I'm Loretta Spiegel. I'm with Rockwood Mansion, and you're watching the 302.
Welcome back. We're at the Bellanca Airfield Museum. We're talking with Bruce Lambrecht about all there is to do and see here. Now, Bruce, when you first walk in the doors, you're greeted by a portrait of Bellanca, and that's one of the first things you see.
That's right, and we have a nice display of the record-breaking airplanes that he created. We have a tribute from the state to the Bellanca Museum. We have a copy of the historic marker that delineates information about Giuseppe Bellanca and why he's important to Delaware. And as we move down the displays, the first section is a display about the early history of Giuseppe Bellanca and what he accomplished. He was recognized because he was significant in aviation. He was on Time magazine. So he is graced on the cover of Time magazine. It talks about his Columbia aircraft and how it flew to Berlin, and there are newspaper displays about their landing there and the celebration they had. It talks about Amelia Earhart and her desire for a Bellanca. She didn't get one, but she wanted one because they were excellent airplanes. Then we move on down through the displays, and it talks about the factory and the factory workers. And we actually have artifacts from the factory. We have some of their tools. We have pictures of the workers working in the factory. We have a nice display of names from the factory of the individuals that served in the war. We also have an interesting picture that Giuseppe Bellanca's secretary had. She had a picture of a seaplane because they built seaplanes here as well. And anybody who was anybody in aviation, she would say to them, "Sign my picture." So we have that picture with all the signatures on it. And we have a nice display, including a nice QR code where you can go to the web and see why those people were important in aviation at that time. And as we move further down, there's a nice display about World War II individuals and how they trained in certain aircraft. We come around the corner and there is an excellent display about Tuskegee Airmen. What I didn't know, and it was very interesting to me, they had Tuskegee nurses that that trained as well and serviced the pilots that were there. So the Tuskegee Airmen, we did have Tuskegee Airmen here in Delaware. We've inducted 2 individuals into the Hall of Fame, and we can talk about them later. But then as we move up the display, we have a nice display of early airfields in Delaware. And if I remember correctly, they were probably about 20.
Really?
We don't have that many anymore, but
No.
it is an interesting display to see where they were and what they contained. We do have maps and we have diagrams of the airports. Then we do move up into a display about women in aviation, one of my favorite subjects. I recently gave a talk about women in aviation to Life Learning Center at Osher down in Dover. And we cover quite a few early names that people don't know and should.
And one of them being a woman who was key in Bellanca's build operation, right?
Absolutely. His first test pilot in 1930s at his factory was a woman named Eleanor Smith. Now, Eleanor Smith was an excellent pilot. She was somewhat of a character, but she got her license at 16. And just a story about her is, there was a fellow tried to fly under a bridge in New York and crashed. And she went up to New York and flew under all 4 bridges. Mayor Walker heard about it and said, "I'm going to take your license away." And he called her in and he said, "Give me your license." And she handed her license to him and he looked at it and it was signed by Orville Wright. And he thought, oh, politically, this is not going to work. And he said, "When was the last time you flew under a bridge?" And she said, 3 weeks ago. And he said, "Have you flown since then?" She said, "No." He said, "That's your punishment. Here's your license back." So amazing political person. But she held a number of altitude records, a number of distance records, and a number of speed records. And she was, once again, an excellent test pilot.
Now, was this unusual to have a woman have that much skill in this field?
It was unusual at the time. Women were fighting, even though, you talk about, okay, they got the right to vote in the 20s, but they weren't accepted. They just weren't. And you talk about people like Bessie Coleman. She was African American and Native American. And they were standing in line to teach her to fly, So she had to go off to France to learn to fly. Then she came back and did air shows. So there's a very, very rich history of women in aviation that people really need to know. And women in Delaware in aviation, we've inducted 14 women into the Hall of Fame.
That's amazing.
In different aspects of aviation.
And we'll talk about a little bit more about the Hall of Fame when we come right back.
I'm Brent, and the Brandywine Zoo loves the 302.
Welcome back. Now, Bruce, we've been talking about the Hall of Fame. So who have you inducted into the Hall of Fame? I know you got some really big names.
Well, we've inducted over 120 people into the Hall of Fame. And I'd like to tell you about just a few of them.
Sure.
We talked earlier about the Tuskegee Airmen. The individual who was the Tuskegee Airman was Fred Johnson. Now, Fred was in school to become a doctor. And he was in his 3rd year of medical school. The war broke out, World War II. He joined the effort and wanted to become a pilot. So he went down and became a Tuskegee Airman, flew during the war as a bomber pilot. And when the war ended, he came back to Delaware, decided he wanted to teach. So he ended up his career as the chairman of science in a school down in southern Delaware. We've inducted, let me talk about a woman. We've inducted Carolyn DuPont Prickett.
Okay.
Carolyn and her husband, Kip DuPont, owned Summit Airport. Kip died at a very early age, unfortunately, and Carolyn kept the airport. Now, she's always fond of saying Kip wouldn't marry her until she became a pilot, but that's a story she likes. She was an excellent pilot. She was qualified in C-47s, P-51s, T-6s, a number of other different aircraft. She was in the powder puff derbies, placed in them. And once her husband died, she took over the airport and ran the airport through some very difficult times and built the airport into an outstanding aviation facility that was recognized across the nation.
When you're talking about the Hall of Fame, there are so many names and you've inducted so many people. So is there a process to do this, or do you have a list of folks that you okay, this year we're going to do this person? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, the trustees cannot nominate. The nominations have to come from the public.
Oh.
So on our website is a nomination form. You go to nominations, look at the form. You can either fill it out on the website, send it electronically, or you can mail it to us. We have our address on there. And it asks for specific information, and you can supply records and documents later if you wish. We take those nominations, and we have a committee that looks at all of the nominations submitted. Now, if someone's not chosen, we don't throw their nomination away. We keep them, and we reevaluate them with the new nominations that come in. So they select about 12 individuals, submit those to the board. The board picks about 6 of those to be inducted. During this process, we also recognize a young person who is interested in aviation. Now, we want someone who is not just interested in aviation, but is well-rounded, who has community involvement, is in the fire company, does volunteer work, that kind of thing. And we choose one individual that we recognize. They're not inducted, but they are recognized for their effort in aviation and the community. And we hold the ceremonies in the fall. This year it'll be October 24th at University of Delaware's Clayton Hall. So, if anybody is interested, please submit a nomination of someone they think is important in Delaware. The criteria are that it should be gallantry in action for the first state or the nation, something significant that shows Delaware in an excellent aviation light, or a significant improvement in aviation in Delaware.
So in addition to taking nominations for the Hall of Fame, you're also endeavoring a lot of projects and programs, is that right?
Right. Well, our major program, once again, is the induction ceremony. We are a nonprofit. We don't get funding from any place other than contributions from the public. We end up pretty much breaking even every year, but that's okay. We continue, and if someone would like to join the Aviation Hall of Fame as a member, that's on our website. If they'd like to make a donation, even better. We will accept donations freely.
Sure.
So,
and it's not just cash. I mean, if you look at the museum, I mean, it must be, some of this stuff is probably donated, right?
Correct. Now, the Friends of Bellanca Airfield Museum, which run the museum here, are a nonprofit as well. And they are supported only by donations and grants. So if someone wants to make a donation, wants to join the airfield, they have a website, friendsofbellancaAirfield.org, which they can come to, and join the Friends of Bellanca. If they have artifacts, we have a number of people that come in and say, my grandmother worked here during the war. And I have a whole bunch of stuff about her, and she kept things from the factory. So that's how we've gained a lot of our artifacts here. It's people bring things in and say, I'd like to donate this to the museum. the museum people would gladly accept it. They will give you a receipt. They are a 501c3, as is the Delaware Aviation Hall of Fame. So any donation, they suggest you take that donation off of your taxes in every tax year. So
if somebody wants to write a check or donate an item, whatever the case may be, who do they call or where do they go?
There are numbers and names on each one of the websites, and just give either one of the organizations a call, and we will set that up for them.
All right, thank you, Bruce, for joining us.
You're welcome.
We'll be right back. For more information on the Bellanca Airfield Museum, you can go to bellancamuseum.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of The 302. We leave you now with some aerials inside the museum. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. We'll see you on The 302.